You're listening to the Fed and Fearless podcast. On today's episode, I'm chatting with Ashley Lilburn about how to eliminate stress and overwhelm from your day-to-day life so you can finally achieve your wellness goals. So stay tuned. Welcome to the Fed and Fearless podcast. I'm your host, Laura Schoenfeld, a registered dietitian, nutrition business coach, and online entrepreneur with over 10 years of experience in online business. And I'm here to show you everything I've learned about creating a life and a business that nourishes you. On this podcast, we'll talk about the lifestyle habits, practical strategies, mindset shifts, and leaps of faith required to build a healthy body, a powerful mind, a strong spirit, and a successful business. Hey there, welcome back to the Fed and Fearless podcast. I'm your host, Laura Schoenfeld, and I'm going to jump straight into our introduction today because we have a super interesting and a little bit longer interview than normal today, but I think you're really going to appreciate the conversation. We talk about all sorts of things around stress and overwhelm and dealing with some of the really unusual emotional and mental challenges that everyone has faced over the past 2 years. So I think you're really going to appreciate this conversation and learn some new things about how to approach your wellness journey so that way you can cut out the overwhelm and really reduce stress and start to feel your best and also help your family feel their best. So today's guest is Ashley Lilburn. When Ashley's daughter was young, she was chronically ill, and by age 5, she was becoming antibiotic-resistant. Ashley was scared, tired, and felt like she had tried everything the doctors asked of her. She began a deep dive into what she could do to help her daughter, and after researching, she made some pretty serious dietary changes for her family. Afterwards, her daughter has not needed medical intervention for illness since. That was 3 years ago, and Ashley was totally mesmerized. Can things that we have control over really have that big of an impact on our health? Yes, they can. So Ashley wanted to share with others, and that's why she enrolled in graduate school at UNTHSC and received a master's in lifestyle health sciences. Now she gets to help individuals create and execute strategies to meet their health and wellness goals. She loves what she does. She loves her clients and especially witnessing people's journey to better health. It's one of the great joys of her life. So Ashley's got a really cool story and has a lot of interesting perspectives to share, especially working with people over the past 2 years during the pandemic and all of the things that we've experienced collectively when it comes to stress and just changes to the way that we live our day-to-day life. So Ashley's got a ton of wisdom to share, and she is just such a pleasure to talk to. She's actually one of my Nutrition Business Accelerator alumni, and so it was super enjoyable for me to have her on to talk about the thing that she's so passionate about, which is helping people get well. So without further ado, here is Ashley Lilburn. All right, everybody. Well, I am so excited to have with us on the show today, Ashley Lilburn. Welcome to the Fed and Fearless podcast, Ashley.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I'm super excited to chat with you today because as of the time of this recording, which is January 2022, there's a lot of sick people out there with the C word that we're not gonna name, but I know we're gonna talk a lot about the things that you're seeing in your wellness practice and the stuff that you're seeing being helpful for people to take care of themselves in a, uncertain time of very contagious illness. So before we get started talking about how you work with clients and the kind of things you're seeing in your wellness business, I'd love for you to tell our audience your story about how you were inspired to become a wellness business owner and to really start helping people with their health.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So my daughter was born almost 9 years ago. She had chronic illness. So by the time she was 5 years old, she was antibiotic resistant. So just as a parent, hearing that is pretty terrifying, knowing that at some point antibiotics will probably save your child's life. was pretty frustrated because I had done everything that a Western medicine doctor had asked me to do. I jumped every hoop. I'd thrown every resource at it. We had done, I can't even tell you. So at that time, I was like, well, we're going to have to take a different road. So I started pursuing alternative medicine. So we did our brick and mortar store is now, Fort Worth Wellness, with the founder. I started working with her. She does something called NAET, which is a really powerful alternative medicine. And then I, at the same time, started reading a book about nutrition and changing some things like taking out gluten and dairy. And they just said the kind of the idea was, well, why not take out gluten and dairy for 30 days and see what happens? So the worst thing possible that's going to come out of this is it's super inconvenient, right? Which it is with kiddos. But we did it overnight. And that was 3.5 years ago. And she has not needed a medical doctor since. So for me, in that moment, just watching my family lives completely shift from having a chronically ill child, which, like, if you've had a chronically ill child, it's so inconvenient. It's so scary. It's so hard. It's so heart-wrenching. To see in 30 days a shift from something as small as a nutritional readjustment was life-changing. I mean, changed our whole family's life for the better, for sure. And I was like, oh man, this is amazing. And I have to share it. And so I went back to grad school. I went to our local med school here in Fort Worth and got my master's in lifestyle medicine. And so I've been on a mission since. I'll be on a mission for the rest of my life to help improve people through alternative medicine alongside Western medicine. Definitely not anti-Western medicine. My kids break their arms. We go to the emergency room. So grateful. But there's definitely other roads to pursue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that you mentioned with the gluten and dairy thing that it was kind of an experiment, right? It wasn't like you thought this will definitely work. It was, let's give it a shot. Can't really get any worse, it sounded like. So I'm sure you've been through a lot of really hard stuff with a sick child. And to do that probably felt like, okay, it's going to be tough, but you can do it if it's something that will actually work. And that's really amazing that it was so effective. And sounds like, your daughter, I'm sure, is way happier not having to deal with all of that illness that no child should have to deal with.
Right. Yeah. And I would say it's been really cool to watch her be really empowered. So because she remembers being so sick, just teaching her, empowering her, never ever saying you can't have this, or this is demonizing food, because I think that can be damaging in its own right. Just teaching her about learning how to read a food label. Now, literally, I packed her a snack that I thought was perfect for school. And she came home and she's like, Mother, I read the food label and there was dairy in it and I did not eat it because it will make me sick. And I was like, that's so cool. I'm so proud of you for taking control of your own health and feeling empowered and knowing what you're looking for. Yeah, that was a bad on me, but it was actually awesome. I was so excited for her.
Yeah, that's so funny that she comes home and is like, Mother, this is what you did today. So I know that in your practice, you see a lot of different types of people, not just children. I'm not even sure if you see children. I don't think we talked about that, but I know that you have a wide variety of types of clients that you're working with at this point. And we had chatted a little bit before starting the recording about what you're seeing, especially in the last 2 years with the pandemic that's been going on. So you had mentioned to me that you focus a lot on stress management in your wellness practice. And I think it's really important to define stress, because I think a lot of people have kind of a narrow definition of what stress is. And when you and I were talking before we jumped on, it was very clear to me that, for you, stress is not just emotional stress. So how do you define stress, and what are the kinds of things that can impact a person's overall stress levels?
Yeah, that's such a good question and such an interesting topic, right? So sometimes an example of how people experience stress different is if you ask somebody, is your brain stressed? Tell me 1 through 10, how stressed is your brain? Somebody may say, oh, it's a 1, I'm not stressed. And they'll say, well, how stressed is your body? And they'll say, oh, it's a 10. I have a lot of tension, right? I feel a lot of stress in my shoulders, or I have a really bad headache every time I feel stressed, but vice versa, right? So people experience stress really differently. And sometimes it's a little distant, it's not integrated, right? Our heads and our bodies. So just those basic questions of where do you feel stress can be really telling. But the way I define stress is actually the physiological cues of stress. So, one of the ways you could test is you could cortisol test people, which we'll do at the clinic just to see, like, are they in a normal range? And I think the other thing is that people are experiencing stress differently because it's so chronic over the last 2 years. So it's unrelenting for so many. Whereas, like, I think prior to the last 2 years, we saw a lot of, for a lot of people, there would be like an acute stressful thing, and it would subside or it wouldn't. But if you add the base layer of constant stress and constant fear to a whole population, the baseline of stress just on a physiological level from cortisol changes. And you end up seeing that presenting in all kinds of physical ailments. And a lot of times we're not actually putting together that the trigger for that physiological illness was stress. But when you look at the HPA axis, so the way that your body actually produces stress hormones, that affects every system. Its little tentacles reach far and wide in your body. So it is a complicated issue, and it adds fuel and flame to whatever was already either genetically predisposed to, or you circumstantially were already kind of set up to experience.
And it's interesting. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole because it could probably be perceived as like political or something, but it's just really interesting. I feel like I've been reading a lot of articles lately where people are starting to question, how do you decide that the pandemic is over, right? And I think something that I'm seeing is a lot of people are either deciding, I'm just going to live my life and not let this be something that's causing fear and stress and anxiety for me all the time. And then you have people who feel that that perspective is irresponsible and, not only to yourself, but to others and, inconsiderate and all of that. So it's just interesting because it's like, even though hopefully, I'm really hoping that we're seeing some improvement as far as the impact that the virus is having on people's health, it's like people have to almost decide to not be in the stress state anymore. And not everybody's making that choice because they feel like, oh, if I decide to not be stressed anymore, it means I'm a bad person or something like that. So it's this crazy like psychological thing that I'm noticing in our society. And we're kind of at the moment of this recording, again, this is January 2022. I have no idea what it's going to be like when even, a month and a half later, this episode comes out. But I am seeing a lot of people starting to talk about that, like just needing to decide for yourself that I'm going to live my life, and not everybody's ready to do that at this point. So I'm sure you see a lot of that in your practice where some people are deciding, or maybe they had decided 2 years ago that they weren't going to, let this be something that totally stresses them out. Or there's people that are deciding that I'm still really stressed out by this and I'm not going to like let down my guard and that kind of thing. Is that what you're seeing with working with people?
Yes, for sure. I think to speak directly to what you're talking about, even the difference for people between the ideologies is an added layer of stress, regardless of which ideology you fall into. So if you're going to have a human interaction, whether or not that person thinks the same as you actually have to put thought behind that. Right? So if you're going to meet somebody there for anything, whether you're coming into the clinic, whether you're going to dinner, whether you're going on a walk for some people, right now, it's like, okay, what are the expectations that that person has of me? And, or am I okay with meeting those expectations? And even just having that extra layer added into every single interaction makes life more stressful for everybody, right? Even if you're on the side of like, well, I'm choosing not to let it stress me out. Most people I know, even if they're falling very heavily into one camp or the other, doesn't want to be a mean human to another person. So if somebody else has strong feelings, like, yeah, sure. Like, I'm happy to do the things that are required, but it takes thought. Right. And so it can cause tension too. I mean, that's the other thing. That's the other place that stress is coming from in this way, is that if you're in a family dynamic, if you're not on the same page, then the close humans that maybe you would actually be allowed to be in interaction with, you really can't be, because it's not a safe space for your ideologies. And there's not just a ton of, I don't think we as a humanity have, for the most part, a whole lot of teachings or tools to teach us how to have conversations around hard topics where we can say it's okay to disagree. So I think that you're seeing all of that, like the nuance of every layer of life becoming just more involved, requires extra mental energy, extra physical energy from every human.
Yeah, I mean, just deciding, like you said, are you going to put a mask on to walk outside? Are you going to put a mask on to go into a grocery store? And I'm sure there's some people that feel like there's a very clear answer to that. But for a lot of us that are kind of like more in the gray area, where it's like, I don't want to be disrespectful, but I also personally am not wearing a mask when I'm walking around my neighborhood. And it's like, definitely I've noticed that issue of not wanting to make other people uncomfortable. So it is really crazy just to see how every single little decision you make when you're leaving your home, right, is like all of a sudden you're so hyper aware of the decisions you're making and how it affects other people and what other people might say to you. And, you know, it's hopefully, I'm like really hoping that in the next few months we'll start to see some breakthrough with that, because it's I think it's really psychologically damaging for a lot of people. And I think it's going to take a while for a lot of people to actually, even if societally we start to calm down about things, when, you know, whenever that is, I believe it will happen at some point, but whenever that is, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that are going to struggle to go back to quote unquote normal, which is a shame. Anyway, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit trail, but I think it is relevant to point that out, because like you were saying, even people who have decided they're not going to continue, or maybe they never were, but let's just say somebody was reasonably afraid during the beginning of the pandemic, and then eventually now they feel like, okay, I think I've done everything I can to be safe. There's nothing else I can do at this point, so I'm going to live my life. There is still other stressors related to the situation our world is in that then, you know, I even think about like parents. I have my trainer, their school, he's got a 2-year-old in their preschool. For 1 week, it's not a rule anymore, but for 1 week, they had a rule that all the children had to wear masks, and his son is 2 years old. And he's like, I don't want my 2-year-old to have to wear a mask all day. And there's no scientific evidence to support that. And luckily they changed the rule, but that's stressful, right? To think about sending your child somewhere that, like, you know, they're having something done to them that you don't want done to them. And so I don't know when we'll get to a place where we're just like not dealing with this anymore. But it's weird when you start to imagine all the different ripple effects that this whole situation has had. And I think what you were saying before, where a lot of people, they don't realize how stressed they are, because it's like they're not perceiving that moment of deciding, oh, do I need to wear a mask into the store if you live in a place that it's not mandated? And you're like, are other people wearing it? Do I need to wear it? Like that kind of thing. And it's, you know, I think we underestimate the emotional impact that even little things like that have on us accumulated over time.
I agree. Like, I think it's the baseline of our stressors is so much higher than it was 2 years ago. And life continues, and life can be really stressful. And so when you still have those acute stressors that do happen for all of us, right? Like, you're a human living in the world, you'll have it, but you're just adding it to a much higher baseline. I see, you know, not only is there a lot of mental health toll, right? And I come kind of from the school of thought that, like, we can't actually separate our bodies, minds, and emotions. Like, they actually are in one vessel and they do actually affect one another. I mean, you can sort them out and deal with them in different ways, but ultimately they're all connected. So I see that does come up. It does affect people. It does affect their health. It's an interesting time in history to kind of witness and watch.
Yeah. Which the added irony is that all of it is to make people quote unquote healthier, right?
I know. I know.
It's like we're doing this for your health, but your health is actually suffering because of all the stress you've been under for almost 2 years now. So yeah, it's definitely a weird thing to be observing. And I'm super blessed to not yet have a child, so I don't have to worry about children's exposure and, experience and everything. But, even just being in those social situations where you're not really sure what somebody's perspective is. And then if somebody is someone who's very committed to wearing masks, they may feel nervous when they see someone without a mask on. I've heard that too, where it's like I've heard people say, the ones that are continuing to wear masks on a regular basis, that they literally feel fear when they see somebody's face. And it's like, that's not the, emotional reaction that you want to have when you see a human's face. I mean, unless somebody's attacking you, right? So it is really scary to think, even after this finishes, whenever that is, it's like there's going to be a ton of people out there that are going to literally be traumatized by not wearing masks for the first time.
And you think about, like, I have a small child, he's 4 going on 5, but half of his life has been spent in pandemic. In our household, we talk about it and we have, I think, but even in that, it's an interesting conversation because we live in Texas, and Texas is very, like, you get to choose. There's not a lot of mandates here. And so there's some freedom in your choice, but what that even causes is an added layer of social pressure. Because then the choice says a lot about what you think, and whether it says what people think it indicates or not, doesn't really matter. Right. And so now we have in schools that children are put in that position as well. Right. So children also have to choose whether they're wearing, 4-year-olds have to choose whether they're going to wear a mask or not. That's an interesting psychological toll for our children. Right. That's an interesting pressure. So, I just think that we'll see this ripple through a mental health space for a long time, like kind of like what you're indicating, no matter where you are on that spectrum, right? Like it'll just be something that's in our collective consciousness for a long, long time.
Yeah, definitely. Well, what are some of the physical ramifications that you're seeing in your clients? The ones that, I mean, like you said, pretty much everyone's exposed to stress. We're not expecting people to live this like cushy, stress-free life because, I mean, honestly, if your life has zero stress in it, first of all, I don't even think that's possible. But if it were possible, it probably means you're not really doing anything out of your comfort zone or taking chances or anything, which is kind of sounds like a boring life. So we know that everybody's got stress, but I'm sure there's certain people that their stress bucket gets so full, it starts to spill over and cause physical side effects. And you and I were talking before we jumped on the recording about some of the things that can show up that people don't really understand. Either the symptoms themselves are like, where is this coming from? Or they don't realize that it is either triggered or caused by stress. So what are some of the things you're seeing in your clinic that are physical manifestations of the impact that the stress has had?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think to your point that what we want to be seeing is stress resiliency. Right? Because like you said, we're all going to experience stress. It's that when we experience stress and we cannot come back to like a homeostasis point, that's how you kind of know that there's an imbalance. And so those imbalances are looking like a lot of things. So one of the ones that we kind of talked about before the interview was mast cell activation. So between the pandemic's virus and like just the massive amount of stress that people are under, I'm seeing quite a lot of mast cell activation and histamine response. And actually it's showing up, and this would make sense, but tons and tons of brand new food allergies for people. So they'll go through the virus and they'll come out the other end, and then they'll have this mast cell activation or this histamine issue. And all of a sudden they can't eat anything without like just huge amounts of inflammation in their skin or GI issues. So that's one. Other ones are when we're recovering, there's long haulers from COVID. It can just really extend that long haulers because our bodies are having to fight so hard, not only against the virus and getting on the other side of it, and then the residual damage from either cross-reactivity or from like mitochondrial damage, essentially. But then also we'll have this stressor, right? And so our bodies can't ever catch up. because the cortisol is just like, we're never down regulated. And so our bodies are never feel safe to actually heal fully. So there's just this spectrum of what stress does to our body, regardless of what we're experiencing physiologically, it just extends it. It's kind of like a magnifying glass on whatever issue you already have.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned food allergies as being a symptom of that. Are there any other symptoms you're seeing that are showing up in these kind of people?
For mast cell, it's there's a lot of skin sensitivities, so it kind of depends on it's such a broad spectrum of symptoms for histamine people. It can even be like heart palpitation. I mean, it just depends how extensive it is. And then for long haulers, what you'll see is just, that they're having a really hard time recovering. You'll see like very like extensive fatigue or weakness or brain fog, or sometimes depending on, again, like how severe it was, you'll have heart issues. We're seeing just a lot of that kind of thing where it's like those things would exist anyway, absolutely, just because of the physiological issues that were there and how the virus works. But definitely it's extended by this stress and then this extra layer of stress,
Yeah. Is there anything you're seeing in people who have not had the virus at this point?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so the mast cell activation, I would say, can absolutely be triggered by the virus, but it can also be triggered by an acute stressful event. And that would look different for all kinds of people. So just depending on the event, when you track it back and you ask them like what was happening, there's generally a pretty big emotional trigger.
Yeah, and there hasn't been any emotional triggers in the last 2 years.
Yes.
None
Right.
whatsoever.
No.
Yeah, and I think even with the mast cell stuff, I didn't have a ton of clients with mast cell issues, but I remember like headaches and, just that like pain reaction being a really common one, joint pain, that kind of thing. And it's hard if you think about like people thinking that like a long hauler syndrome, because I had COVID I guess it was a year and a half ago almost at this point. And the main symptoms that stuck around for me was issues with my smell. I feel like what probably happened is that my olfactory bulbs or whatever the cells were that got damaged with the actual like loss of smell entirely just didn't reform properly, or like we're kind of, they were being rebuilt. Cause like obviously I shouldn't say obviously, as I'm sure cells can regenerate, right? And I don't know if this is 100% true, but I've heard this before that every cell in our body regenerates within 2 years. So if you look at yourself 2 years ago, like all of the cells in your body are new at that point, which is kind of nuts. So we know that cells can regenerate and rebuild and heal. And I think what they were saying about the smell issues is that the cells were coming back and like healing, but they weren't sending signals and like communicating effectively. It's really interesting because looking into the healing process for that, a lot of it was psychological, like imagining what something was supposed to smell or taste like while you were actually eating it. So it's kind of nuts how that works. But it's just interesting to think, you have that massive inflammation that happens if somebody gets really sick from COVID. Obviously, not everybody gets really sick, but the more sick somebody gets, we can imagine that the more inflammation is happening. And then on top of that, all the stress that you're experiencing emotionally and in your day-to-day life, like that just creates this whole storm of inflammation that's happening. And then the question is, okay, is the lingering effects because of the virus, or was that just kind of the trigger that like kind of started the cascade, but then because your stress resilience was so low going into that illness, your body's just not recovering? I don't know if you have a perspective about that or if it's just kind of an interesting thought about what might be going on, because there's not exactly a ton of research on this situation right now.
Right. Yeah. It's like very much a chicken or an egg situation. And I think that it's an interesting question to kind of think about, but I'm not sure it's the question that you ultimately ask. The question is like, how can we help people get back to resiliency? And so I think, again, like I think it comes, in my perspective, it comes back from not separating systems out. So we can't just be like, hey, your brain is just like one silo and your body is one silo and your emotions are one silo. It's like, no, it's all connected. And so if we are treating the body, but we are not treating the brain or emotions, then can we have true healing? So I think in my mind, the question becomes like, how do we simultaneously help you? Like, yes, you definitely have physiological issues. Is it being irritated and exaggerated because you're also having stress and having a hard time recovering your resiliency in a mental way? Like, I think those are super connected. And I think the question becomes, how can we help do both of those at the same time?
Yeah, because I see, there's a lot of people recommending supplement protocols and that kind of thing. A lot of the supplements are focused on anti-inflammatory effects. And not that that's bad. Of course, that's helpful if you can help kind of calm inflammation. But if that's all you're doing, I feel like that's probably not going to be the most effective thing if you are somebody who has a lot of emotional and mental stress on top of the physiological inflammatory response that you had.
Right. I agree. I think that to benefit the most, you have to do both the work, right? You have to do the physiological work that is required to recover. And sometimes that's lifestyle change. Sometimes it's supplementing. Sometimes it's taking a Western medicine drug that's required because there's damage. And I think also we have to address like, how can we create new patterns in our mind, new patterning in our brains so that we can choose to move into a new space, so that our bodies can downregulate, so that we are allowed to heal and we are allowed to digest properly and we are allowed to sleep and rest deeply. Like all of those things are absolutely required to ultimately come back to homeostasis.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the words you had used before we jumped on the recording was this concept of overwhelm. And that's another word, kind of like stress, that means a lot of things. So what do you feel like is causing, at least the people that you work with, that you were mentioning before we jumped on, that you live in a certain area of Texas that has, probably a specific type of lifestyle and maybe some specific social pressures and expectations around what your day-to-day life should look like. What do you think might be triggering that feeling of overwhelm in the people that you're working with?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And just I realized that this would be really different if it was in a different setting. And so it's not good or bad, it's just a different set of circumstances. But I think that for the clientele that I see, that generally what we're talking about is more time poverty. And so it's not as much as a resource issue or like an education issue, which it would be in a different clinic. And I think that those are really important pieces too. But in my specific setting, it's more about time poverty. So people have the information and know what I hear this a lot, should do, right? Like we call it shoulding all over yourself. Like I should be doing this, I should be doing that. And it's like, yeah. Like, cool. Is that helping you actually do the thing that's helpful? No, probably not, right? Because then we just feel bad about ourselves and add stress because our self-narrative is negative. And so I think the overwhelm that I see comes from the lack of time and just being like, I need time. And a lot of that, right? It could be one of two things. It can be time to actually do the healing that is required, or it can be the time that is required so that you don't have to heal.
And what would be, in the people that you're working with, what would be some examples of things that are causing them to lack time? Because this is a very cliche statement that all of us have 24 hours in a day, right? Like that's always what you hear when people, say, I don't have time for something. But what kind of either circumstances or choices, because I think a lot of times the time we have available, there is a lot of choice involved, not 100% of the time, obviously. As an example, with your child being sick and having to go to doctor's visits, that wasn't a choice, right? Like that had to happen and probably took a lot of time. I know for me, even just having to go to prenatal visits, it's like, oh, that was a 2-hour time block that before I got pregnant would have not been in my schedule. So there's definitely things that are not choices, but I'm guessing if if your clients are anything like the people I've worked with in the past, there's a lot of choices being made that create the time poverty or the schedule that they are adhering to. So what would be some things that could be causing that lack of time in somebody's life?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that you have the logistical things that you're talking about just running a household, a business, a family. Everybody has their own circumstances, but if you have a couple of kids and they're in school, or maybe they're in different schools, right? Like even that is like extra time that you have to spend logistically figuring out how to do that. Or you run a business, or you have employees that depend on you, or whatever that looks like. There's the logistical things, but then the overwhelm, I feel like, and I'm so guilty of this. So like when I say it's not in judgment. It's just like, oh yeah, like we're human and this is what we do. what I think often happens is that people feel overwhelmed and their first choice to check out, kind of mindlessly, is usually social media. And it's a huge time suck, right? Like social media can be valuable to some degree, and I'm not anti-social media at all. And I think that if it is something that we're consciously choosing and we're like, oh yeah, I need 5 minutes to just like let my brain off the hook and I'm going to scroll for 5 minutes, that can be a productive and at least a chosen time way to spend our time. But I think what happens for all of us, again, I'm right in there with everybody else. Like I'm not innocent of this. Is like, I feel overwhelmed. I probably really need like an actual something. Like I probably need to eat or drink some water or pee or take a walk. But instead, it's so much quicker and easier to just hop on my phone and like buzz out for a minute, right? But then that turns into 30 minutes. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, wake up to the world. And it's like, well, I haven't made lunches for tomorrow. And I haven't, and you get in this overwhelm again, right? Where the choice that you just made actually put you into more overwhelm. And so I think there's that kind of thing for all of us, right? Like very few people do I know have enough discipline to be like, no, I never make a choice that isn't conscious. Most of us are like, get into our habits or into a space where like, we just need to check out for a minute instead of asking what does my body or my brain need, right? We just like choose the lowest hanging fruit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a lot of our listeners are entrepreneurs. And something I've seen with a lot of my clients, especially as their businesses take off, is they're choosing to say yes to so many opportunities or to add complexity to their businesses that doesn't need to be there. And so a lot of what I end up doing, especially with the people who are getting into that, like I've kind of maxed out my, my business, my time, that kind of thing, is actually looking at, okay, well, what are you choosing to do in your business that's causing that feeling of overwhelm? And I don't know how, I don't have a family other than a husband yet. Like I'm sure, ask me in a year, I'm sure I'll have a different perspective on this after I have a baby. But I feel like even within a business, when you're an entrepreneur, there's a lot of choices that you make that they are kind of on autopilot. Like this is something I've definitely noticed this year, because one of our big goals in the business is to really get me out of the operations day to day and have my team member, Jen Zacconi, who I know you know from the MBA program, she's being trained to take over as a role called an integrator, which is also called a COO, or, I guess that's Chief Operating Officer. And that for me, as somebody who's been a mostly solopreneur for 8 years, it's like very weird to actually be handing stuff off. And I find myself like even this year as I'm working on training her to be like my launch manager and that kind of thing, it's like my go-to is just to do something myself. Like if something needs to get done, it's like my brain is just like, all right, I'll go do it. Which, when you're building your business is a super beneficial mindset to have, because, if you're like, oh, something needs to get done, but I'm going to avoid doing it, that's not going to be super helpful. But when you get to a place in your business where it's like, it's no longer actually beneficial to the business for you to do everything, which honestly doesn't take that long. That decision to start outsourcing and handing things off and training other people to do it is like, that takes a lot of effort and a lot of like change as far as what your habits are. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that affects people in their day-to-day life as well, where they've decided that, oh, I have to do this thing, or we have to do, all the kids have to be in sports, all the kids have to be, driven to school, even though technically they could take the bus, or all, that kind of stuff. It's like, I think a lot of people are making choices out of feeling an obligation to do that thing, whether it's social pressure, beliefs that they have, that kind of thing. And they're not necessarily looking at the day-to-day life that they have and being really mindful of like, well, how are you spending your time? And is it actually worth doing that? Because it's so easy, I think, in our modern society to have a schedule that's over full, especially if you have kids, right? Because then you're managing their lives too. So it's like, and this is, again, something I'm learning in the entrepreneur space, but I think you can apply it to a family as well. Being super conscious about, okay, do we actually need to do this thing? Like things that you've signed up for, obligations that you feel like you have, even stuff like, cleaning your house is, especially for somebody who's an entrepreneur and has maybe some wiggle room with their finances, it's like, is that actually a valuable way for you to be spending your time, or should you hire somebody to help with that? And so I feel like, again, for a lot of people, and this isn't everyone, and as we were saying before, there are people who have actual like, financial poverty, that kind of thing. We're not necessarily speaking about that situation, but the people who have that time poverty, a lot of times it is because they're not actually consciously choosing how they're spending their time as much as possible. And they're kind of just letting their schedule create itself and then getting into a place where it's like, well, this is just how things are and I can't change it, even though they actually could change it if they actually recognized it and took some time to make those adjustments. So I went off on a little tangent there, but that's just something I was thinking about because it was, it's something I've definitely noticed for sure the last couple of weeks for myself, that tendency to say, oh, I'll just go do it myself. And it's like, no, if I want to have a business that I'm not doing everything myself, I have to actually train people to do this. And yeah, it feels weird at first, but I know that down the road when somebody else is doing all this stuff, especially when I'm, postpartum with my first baby, it's going to be like the best thing ever. So it's like having that future vision of like what my life can look like when I do the uncomfortable stuff now to change my habits.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, what I hear you saying is talking about like essentially like whether it's in the entrepreneurial space or personally is processes, right? Like I think that we get really habitual because we have always done it this way or because it's how our parents did it or whatever. And we don't take the time because it does take so much effort to put the brakes on and say like, is this really the way that we want to drive forward? And if not, we're going to have to make some behavioral changes. And in behavior science, so my undergrads in psychology and behavior science, there's traditionally like they'll say like, well, what you would do is create goals and the goals would create systems. And then James Clear from Atomic Habits, which I know that you're familiar with because MBA, we were recommended that. And it's a wonderful, beautiful book. And it actually kind of flips it on its head and says like, no, like actually what we have to do is think about what our identity is, right? And our identity will then, if we start to identify as something, we create systems that implement and support that identity. And I think that it's really easy, especially in the demographic that I see that has a lot of time poverty, to identify really, really easily and well with, I'm busy. That's who I am. I'm busy and I'm important because I'm busy. And I do it too. Like, I mean, I'm there's no judgment around it. Like I'm really good at that as well. And it actually takes a lot of effort for me to put the brakes on and be like, but is that even what you want? Right? Do you even want to be so busy that you're like, barely breathing or having to think about peeing? Like that's dumb. But I do that to myself, right? Like, and so I think that when you're in that space, that often, you're like, I'm so busy, I don't have time to think about processes, right? I definitely think that whether you're applying that to a personal choice or a business, like those are all things that I think what the word that keeps coming up for me is mindfulness. So when I'm teaching people about stress management, even if it's, ultimately for their physiological health, it's about, we start with mindfulness. Because without awareness, there's no change because we don't even know that it could change.
Right. And I think even the goals thing is interesting because whether it's a health goal or a business goal, you have this idea of what you want your life to look like. And that's what I kind of think about goals is like, that's what you want your life to look like. And the goal doesn't necessarily have to be like a financial goal or some kind of accomplishment goal. It can be, how do I actually want to live my life and what do I want my day-to-day, time to be spent doing? But when we do goal setting with the work that I do with clients, you want to think through, okay, what do I want my life to look like? And then you work backwards to, okay, if I want to have that result, who am I being? And am I being the kind of person that gets that kind of result? So, if it's a health thing, it's like, okay, if I want to have great energy during the day, am I being the kind of person? Am I making the choices? Am I doing the things that somebody who has great energy does? And if you're getting 5 hours of sleep a night, if you are scheduled from like 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. throughout your day, you're, barely getting food in, like all of that, that's not the habits of somebody who has great energy, right? And it's the same thing with business. If you want to have, a $500,000 a year business and you are doing everything yourself and, trying to do too many things and having no boundaries with clients and, afraid to show up on social media or like just afraid to be in front of your audience, that kind of thing. Like that's not being the kind of person that runs a $500,000 a year business, right? So I think goals are helpful because goals are just a description of what you want to experience in your life. They don't have to be this like massive accomplishment. It's just like, hey, my goal is to only work 30 hours a week. What needs to change to make that happen? And then you can work backwards to say, okay, then what's the identity that I need to take on in order for that to actually be created in my life? And like I said, I definitely think it applies to health because, yeah, obviously there's going to be things outside of your control, things that happen that you can't necessarily like identity yourself out of. But I do think for a lot of people, much of what they're experiencing in their physical wellness or lack thereof is because they identify in a certain way that's not conducive to improving those outcomes.
I totally agree. I have was working with a client earlier this week, and for chronic asthma that he's had since he was 3. And there's definitely a stress component. Like he can feel it in his body shift a little bit when he feels stress, and he's more likely to actually get an attack due to inflammation. It all makes perfect sense. And we were talking about this exact conversation. And he's actually from my Sunday school group. And so, we were teasing because we were saying like, it's not like, what would Jesus do? But it's like, what would healthy client do? What does healthy client do? Like, that's really the question, that we have to ask is kind of like to your point. Like, I think so often we're thinking about goal-oriented self as like future self. So like future Ashley is healthy. Future Ashley has this thing. Future Ashley does this or that. Versus like, no. Like future Ashley is completely dependent on present Ashley acting as though she has those things. And so what does it look like? And so bringing that, it's kind of the difference between an intention and an affirmation, like bring ourselves into that present space and owning those identities now, even if it's not what shows up in this moment, is how we create those habits and those systems that put us in success mode, regardless of whether that's health or business or family, frankly. I mean, it's a conversation to have with, it's a conversation my husband and I have a lot right now. Is like, what is valuable? Is money valuable? Is time more valuable? Like, where is that line? And there's not a right or wrong answer, but it's definitely a conscious choice, or should be, needs to be.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even for me, my coach asked me a couple weeks ago as we're preparing for this year in his mastermind, like what my goals are. And he was like, just remember, they don't have to be financial. Like, yes, having financial growth is always exciting, but it doesn't only have to be a financial goal. And for me, I was like, yeah, it'd be great to increase revenue this year, but I honestly I'd be more happy if I kept revenue stable and cut down on my hours and was able to take like 2 months off, which I've never done that before, than if I'm like working my butt off just to hit a revenue number that's like totally arbitrary, right? So it's not to say, of course, I think money is valuable, right? Like money can do a lot for you and it can create time. I really do believe that it can actually like bring time back into your schedule because you can pay to outsource things. But there does tend to be this tipping point of like, all right, at what point is it like, are you chasing something that you think is going to make your life better, which again, for a lot of people is money. Whereas like if you were to kind of slow down and maybe live with less, but have that time back, that you would actually be a lot happier and a lot more fulfilled in life. And so that's always kind of the balance I'm personally trying to strike, because it's really easy to get caught up in that like very tangible, linear, like societally approved goal, right? Of making more money. That's always what people want. And it's, for me, I'm never going to be willing to sacrifice my physical well-being in order to achieve that. And so every year it's like this, it's almost like a game to try to figure out, okay, can we increase revenue without me having to work more? And maybe I could even work less. Not that I don't want to work, like I love working, but it's like, especially if I have a baby, it's like, I'm not going to want to work 40 plus hours a week if I have a newborn, right? So being able to ask those questions and be curious about how could life look and what is important to me and what needs to change so that those things have space in my life because, there's only so much room that we have in our schedule for things, and making those conscious choices, whatever it is, I think is unfortunately not taught. We're not really like trained how to do that. That's something and I'm sure you've learned because of personal growth and deciding to learn more about these things. But I do think the more we could bring that into the wellness space, the more people could realize like you get to decide if you want to spend your life the way that all your friends and neighbors are doing it. And they're all like running around like a chicken with their head cut off. You don't have to participate in that. And yeah, maybe there might be some like side eyes about, oh, like she's, not like a good mom or something because she's not doing XYZ. But as long as you're happy with the choices that you're making, I don't think it's anyone else's business what you decide to do with your life and your time.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's a really valuable thing to know that the systems we put in place, the product that we have is exactly the product of the systems we put in place. Right. And with our health as well, with the caveat of there are things we can't control. Right. But there's a lot that we can. And I think like when, you asked me earlier, because I've gone through the MBA and it was just so game changing for me. It was like 100. I mean, I got so much more out of it than, it was wonderful. It's a great decision to make. And, you're asking me, well, like, are you like, have you niched? And, my situation's a little different because I also work at a brick and mortar clinic as well as online. But like as we're talking, I'm like, oh, like the niche, the only thing I want is to empower people. Like, that's really all I want is for people to feel like they have some path and some control over their health. And I think that we've been told for generations, not just in the last 2 years, for so long, that if you haven't gone to med school and you can't write a script, that you don't have any control over your health. And just in my personal experience from the beginning of this podcast with my daughter, like it was life-changing to be like, that's just a lie. Like, that's just not true. Like that, I don't know if it was a lie somebody told me, a lie I picked up, a lie that I told myself, but that just was not true. What is true is we're so empowered to make these changes that can change our lives and our families' lives and our neighbors' lives. And if I teach one mom something and she's got 4 kids and I teach her how to supplement her children through a virus, like not even COVID, but just like a kid virus, and she can feel empowered and like she knows what to do, that's what I want. Like, that's my life's mission, is to just empower other humans to be like, no, I can do something. I do have the knowledge. I have the ability to understand what my body needs because I live in it. Like, I have the lived experience of being in it. And so I get to say what's right or wrong for it. So I was thinking like, yeah, that is kind of what I've niched in. That's a really broad answer and not at all, I think, what you were going for an MBA when you said niche, but in this moment, that is kind of where it's at. And it's such a beautiful like privilege to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I told Ashley earlier before we jumped on the recording, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it sounds like she's got some really great clients and almost more clients maybe than she even needs or would need to have a successful business. And I just love your passion and your excitement for helping people. I think that's more important to the success of your business than your perfect niche. So hopefully none of you think that, oh, but my business is going really well, but maybe I'm doing something wrong. It's more about, are you doing what's effective to get the result you want? And if Ashley is happy with the result she has, then there's really no reason to change anything. But I feel like that was a very much mic drop moment, all of that you just shared. And I know we could talk a lot longer, but unfortunately we do have to wrap our conversation for today. But it's been such a great experience chatting with you about so many things that I don't really think we planned on necessarily, but I love these kind of spontaneous conversations because I just find them more interesting than something that's like super scripted. So I appreciate your willingness to go down the rabbit trails with me.
Yeah, thank you. It was like just so wonderful. It's lovely, lovely to talk with you.
Awesome. Well, I would love to share with our audience, if people are interested in learning about what you do and possibly working with you to get some help with this, overhaul of their system so that they can actually reach their health and wellness goals. where can people connect with you and what would be their next step if they're wanting more from you?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So you can connect with me virtually via ashleylilburnwellness.com. You can connect with me if you're in Fort Worth, Dallas area at Fort Worth Wellness. That's our bricks and mortar space where we have a clinic. And then right now I'm seeing a lot of people acutely. So there's a virtual acute care via my website that you can go on if you're struggling with something, whether it is viral or kids earache, and you're just looking for holistic health with, okay, like what can I do to empower myself, like with lifestyle medicine and with supplementing to help my family or myself. You can go onto my website and easily book yourself an appointment.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure that there's links in the show notes to Ashley's website and her acute care opportunity. This is episode 124. If you guys want to go check that out at lauraschoenfeldrd.com. But like I said, Ashley, it was so great to get to chat with you today about some really timely issues that are, I'm sure, going to be on people's minds for a long time, not just while this pandemic is still officially happening, I guess. I don't know who decides it's over. I don't know if there's going to be some like newsletter that goes out or something, but I know that there's a lot of people out there that have had a challenging couple of years, whether they got COVID or not. I think everyone's gone through some pretty serious stuff in the last 2 years. So if you are struggling with your health and you're struggling to figure out why you haven't gotten better, or, you just know that your life isn't set up to really promote wellness and you're not experiencing the kind of health is possible for you, then sounds like Ashley is a great person to help you get to where you want to be. So thanks so much, Ashley. It was such a pleasure to chat with you. And thanks for those of you listening for hanging out with us. And we will look forward to seeing you here next week on the Fed and Fearless podcast. Take care, everybody. Are you a nutritionist or dietitian struggling to figure out how much to charge for your programs and services? Maybe you've heard that as a nutritionist, you should just charge what you're worth. But this way of thinking can cause you to either undercharge your clients or work yourself into the ground trying to earn your worth. As a healthcare provider, you can't set up a pricing structure that forces you to sacrifice your own health and well-being in the name of your business and your clients. But I promise it doesn't have to be this way. When you download my free profit planning workbook, I'll walk you step by step through the 10-step process for determining the right pricing for your nutrition business. As a nutritionist, you have the power to completely change someone's life for the better. There's huge value in that, so it's time to stop underselling what you do. By following along with this worksheet, you can determine exactly what you need to charge to achieve your revenue goals with ease. I'll teach you everything I've learned about pricing from growing my own nutrition business to over $250,000 in revenue annually and helping other dietitian and nutrition entrepreneurs hit their first $10,000 to $30,000 months and beyond. To get your free workbook, go to lauraschoenfeld.com/profit, PROFIT, and grab your copy today, so you no longer have to wonder how to set the right rates for your incredibly valuable nutrition services. That's lauraschoenfeld.com/profit. It's time to make the money that you deserve as a nutritionist, and I can't wait to help you get there.